The night I understood what the last 2 years had actually been, I was standing in a hallway in my socks at 3 in the morning, holding a glass of water I'd gotten up to drink and then forgotten about completely. I hadn't meant to stop outside her door. I'd heard the sound, low, unguarded, the specific sound of someone crying who has waited until they were certain no one could hear, and something in me had stopped moving before I'd decided to. I stood there for a long time. Through the door I could hear her voice, broken into pieces by the crying, talking to someone on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I was just there. The hallway was dark, and the apartment was quiet, and the only light was the thin strip coming from under her door. And I stood in that dark and held a glass of water and heard my roommate say my name. Not to me. I want to be clear about that. She said it to whoever was on the phone, in the middle of something I wasn't meant to hear. In the tone people use at 3 in the morning when they finally stop performing and are just saying the true thing to the one person they trust with it. She said my name, and then she said something else that I couldn't quite catch, and then she cried again, and I stood very still in the hallway and understood that I had just heard something that was going to change the shape of everything that came after it. I went back to my room. I didn't knock. I didn't make a sound. I set the glass of water on my nightstand, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about 2 years and what I'd been calling them, and whether the name I'd given them was the honest one. It was not. My name is Seth Calloway. I'm 33. I manage operations for a small logistics company, schedules, systems, the infrastructure of keeping things running on time, which suits me, because I'm the kind of person who finds comfort in things that function as designed. I like a plan. I like a known quantity. I like understanding the shape of a situation well enough to navigate it without surprises. Which is why the 2 years I'd spent living with Juno Park had been, by nearly every measure I trusted, the most consistently surprising stretch of my adult life. I had not anticipated this. I had not planned for it. I had not done anything about it, because doing something about it would have required admitting what it was, and I'd been running a solid 2-year operation of not admitting what it was. She was 31. She did freelance graphic design, which meant she worked from the apartment at hours that had no consistent relationship to the clock. Up at 10, up at midnight. Sometimes not up yet at noon, sometimes still working when I left at 7:30. The apartment held both schedules without complaint, which was more than I could say for my thinking. She had moved in as a practical solution, a mutual friend's connection, a fair split on a 2-bedroom I couldn't swing alone, and had become. Over 24 months of shared mornings and borrowed cereal and long evenings on the couch we'd found on the curb and carried up 4 flights together. The person whose presence had quietly reorganized the architecture of my day. She had dark eyes and a laugh that ambushed you, and an alarming number of opinions about furniture arrangement that she acted on without warning, so that I would come home to find the living room in a different configuration, with no explanation except Juno standing in the middle of it saying, "Doesn't it feel better this way?" Which it usually did, which was its own separate problem. She talked to her plants by name. She made elaborate breakfasts at 11 on Saturdays, and ate them in front of documentary series about ocean systems, and narrated additional commentary at the screen as though it could hear her. She had a best friend named Clara, who she talked to on the phone for hours, and a sister in Portland she texted in voice memos, and a mother who called every Sunday at 9 and who Juno always answered, even when she was clearly in the middle of something. Because she'd told me once that her mother had gone through a long stretch of bad years, and Juno had missed too many calls during it, and had decided to never miss another one. I had cataloged all of this without meaning to. That is the honest account. We had been good roommates. Genuinely good. The kind where the system runs without friction. Where someone replaces the dish soap before it's empty, and someone else takes out the recycling without a chart on the fridge. Where the small negotiations of shared space get conducted without escalation or resentment. Beyond good roommates we had been, I thought, good friends. We watched things together. We cooked dinner some nights, separately and sometimes together. We talked about her projects and my systems problems, and the news and the building's eccentric super, and the ongoing question of whether the diner on the corner had genuinely improved or if we had simply lowered our standards. I had called all of it friendship. I had called it that carefully and consistently, and with a definiteness that had done real work, because I'd needed the word to be a wall and not a window. The 3 a.m. call happened on a Wednesday in February. I know the date because I'd been awake anyway, a work problem I'd been running logistics on in my head, which was a habit my body hadn't yet learned to schedule for daylight hours. I got up for water. I walked down the hall. And I stopped. I stood there for maybe 4 minutes. Long enough to understand what I was hearing, and to understand that I was not going to knock. That knocking would be the wrong thing for every reason. That what she needed at 3 a.m. was not me standing in the doorway having overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. I went back to my room. I lay in the dark. And I thought, for the first time without immediately stopping myself, about what I actually felt. The answer took about 30 seconds to surface and another hour to stop arguing with. Here is the thing about understanding something you've been not understanding on purpose. The understanding doesn't wait for a convenient moment. It arrives at 3 a.m. in a dark room, and it stays there, solid and exact. And in the morning it is still there. And the morning after that, and you carry it around in your chest like a stone you've agreed to hold, and don't know how to set down. I didn't say anything. Not that week. Not the week after. The operation of not saying was familiar. I'd been running it for 2 years. But something had changed in the running of it. Because now the not saying was a choice I was making consciously. Every morning, rather than a comfortable ambient assumption, and conscious choices have a weight that ambient assumptions don't. She didn't know. That was the most important thing, and I held it carefully. Whatever she'd said on that phone, in that dark, to Clara or her sister or whoever had been on the other end, she hadn't said it to me. She'd said it in the way people say things at 3 a.m. when the walls of the self have come down for a few hours and the truth can get out, privately, safely, in the one place she'd been certain it couldn't be heard. I was going to let that be true. I owed her that. What I wasn't going to do was keep pretending to myself. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the ones before. Not because anything changed outwardly. We were still the same 2 people in the same apartment, with the same furniture arrangements and the same Saturday breakfasts, but because I was now seeing it all without the taxonomy I'd been using. The way she handed me coffee in the morning without asking how I took it, because she'd known for a year. The way she said my name when she was going to tell me something she decided I needed to know. A specific emphasis, like a hand on a shoulder. The way she laughed harder at things I said than things were sometimes worth. And the way she didn't perform not laughing when something wasn't funny, which was its own kind of honesty, and one I'd always appreciated, without understanding why I appreciated it so particularly. I thought about the couch. Not a small thing. We'd carried it up 4 flights on a Saturday in July. Both of us bad at it, stopping on every landing, negotiating the corners with the collaborative fluency of people who had already learned each other's rhythm without noticing they'd been learning it. At the top, she'd sat down on it right there on the landing and said she was never moving again. And I'd sat beside her because there was nowhere else, and we'd stayed there for 20 minutes in the stairwell because neither of us could be bothered to finish the last 10 feet. and we talked about nothing while the building went quiet around us. And I had thought then that this was one of the better moments I could remember, and filed it under "we get along well" and closed the cabinet. I reopened all the cabinets. Every one. It took about 3 weeks, and it was, professionally speaking, the least efficient operation I had ever run. She called Clara the third Saturday after the night in the hallway. I know because Clara called back from a different number. Juno's phone had died. She borrowed mine. And I heard enough of the conversation from the kitchen to understand it was a continuation of something, some ongoing thread that Clara was familiar with. And Juno's end of it was careful and laughing, and once or twice went quiet in a way that wasn't sad. Just the quiet of someone choosing words. I didn't piece together from that call what I already knew. What I did was stand in the kitchen making pasta and register, very precisely, that there was a person on my couch using my phone who felt like the right person to be on that couch, which was the most specific and undefended thought I'd had about her yet. And I set it down on top of all the other unclosed cabinets and went back to the pasta. The night things changed started, as most things in our apartment started, without particular announcement. She came home late from a client meeting that had gone wrong. I could tell from the way she dropped her bag on the floor instead of the hook, which was her single reliable tell. The bag always went on the hook unless something had happened. She stood in the middle of the living room in her coat and said, "The Brennan project is probably dead." 6 months of work. Not to me specifically, to the room, to the fact of it. I said I was sorry. I meant it. She sat on the couch. I sat on the other end. She told me the whole thing, the client, the revision that had been approved and then unapproved, the work that had probably never had a real chance, and which she'd known that and done it anyway, because the brief was good, and sometimes you do things because the brief is good, and the client turns out to be the variable you can't design around. I listened the way I listened when she talked about work, without managing it, without problem solving, just tracking. She talked for 20 minutes. At the end she said, "Okay, I'm done," and sat back and looked at the ceiling. "The brief really was good," I said. "I know," she said. "That's the part that gets me." We sat there. The apartment did the thing it did at night when the building settled. Small sounds. The radiator. Someone 2 floors up. And she had her head back against the cushions and her eyes on the ceiling, and I was looking at the side of her face, thinking about the brief, and also not thinking about the brief at all. "Seth," she said to the ceiling. "Yeah. Do you ever feel like you've been in a room for a long time and you know exactly where everything is, and then one day the furniture moves and you realize you only knew where things were because they hadn't moved yet?" I thought about that. "Yes," I said. Recently, she turned her head on the cushion to look at me. "What moved for you?" Something in my chest went still. Not the dramatic kind. Just the kind where a body understands it's at a juncture and is taking a moment before the next step. "Something I heard," I said. "Carefully, a few weeks ago." "I don't think you knew I heard it." She looked at me, not the guarded look, not the performed look, the one underneath, the one I'd seen in the hallway light and in Saturday stairwells and in the way she handed me coffee without asking. "What did you hear?" she said. "Your name for it," I said quietly. "Not mine." I watched her understand. It moved through her face slowly, not shock. Something gentler than shock, the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight they assumed was invisible and has just learned that it wasn't, and is deciding whether the not being invisible is the terrible thing they'd expected, or something else entirely. Her hands had gone still on the cushions beside her. "I wasn't going to say anything," I said. "I want you to know that. Whatever you said it when you thought you were alone, I don't need you to do anything with it. I can't keep pretending I didn't hear it. Not to you." She didn't say anything for a long moment. The radiator ticked. Outside a car passed, and the light swept across the ceiling and was gone. "The furniture moved for me a long time ago," she said. Finally. Quiet. Honest. The 3 a.m. voice in the daytime, which was the bravest version of it. "I just didn't think you'd noticed the room had changed." Something in me loosened, all at once, the way a thing does when it's been held at tension for longer than was ever reasonable. "I noticed," I said. I just needed longer to admit I'd noticed. She looked at me from the other end of the couch, not reaching. She wasn't the type to reach. She'd wait to see what I did with it, which I had always known, and which was its own kind of trust. I closed the distance, slowly, and I did not grab for her or rush the moment, just turned toward her and let the turning say what it said. She looked at me with those dark eyes, and something in her face came down. Some last organized piece of the self she'd kept upright for 2 years in close proximity to the things she'd been careful about, and I said, "You can stop being careful. We can both stop." She exhaled. Long. Quiet. The specific exhale of a person who has been holding something in for a long time and has finally been told they're allowed to set it down. Then she reached over and took my hand, simply, and laced her fingers into mine, and neither of us said anything for a while. The apartment settled around us. The radiator did its usual thing. Outside, the city was being itself, indifferent and bright. And inside it was just the two of us on a couch we'd carried up 4 flights and never moved since, because it had always been exactly right where it was. She fell asleep there, eventually, the way she did when she'd been running on too little sleep and something finally let go of her. I stayed where I was. I was good at long operations. I didn't mind the waiting. In the morning, she made elaborate Saturday breakfast even though it was a Wednesday, because she said Wednesdays that had been hard enough earned the same treatment, and I agreed with her. And she made eggs and talked to her plants and narrated at the documentary she put on, and somewhere in the middle of it she looked at me over the kitchen counter and said, "You could have knocked." "No," I said. "I couldn't." She thought about that. "No," she agreed. "You couldn't." She slid a plate across the counter. I caught it. She went back to the documentary. The morning was good and ordinary, and ours in a way that mornings hadn't quite been before. A shade different. The room rearranged in a way that finally matched where everything had actually been sitting all along. The months that followed were the slowest and the best. We didn't rush. We'd both done enough not rushing to understand that the pace of a thing matters as much as the thing. She rearranged the furniture twice more, both times without warning, and both times I came home and stood in the doorway and felt the room settle into a better version of itself. And that, I thought, was the whole of it. The room was always trying to be what it was always going to be. We just needed to stop arguing with the arrangement. She called Clara the first Sunday after the Wednesday, and I heard her from the kitchen say, "Yes, I know. I know. I know." And then laugh, the full one, the one she didn't spare, the one that had been ambushing me for 2 years. I went on making coffee and felt something snap into place that hadn't been loose so much as held at a careful distance from the thing it was supposed to connect to. A year later, I came home to the furniture in a configuration I genuinely hadn't anticipated. She'd moved the couch to face the window instead of the television, which was a real change, a structural one. And she was sitting in it with her feet up and her laptop and a plant she'd moved from the bedroom. And she looked up and said, "It's better this way." I stood in the doorway and looked at the room. The window light came in differently now. The whole space felt opened up, like something that had been turned toward the wall had finally been turned toward the light. Yeah, I said. It is. She made room. I sat beside her. The city did its evening thing outside the window, and she went back to her work and I went back to mine. And the room held us the way rooms do when they've finally been arranged correctly, without effort, without apology, as if it had always been exactly this. Years later, when people asked how we got together, she said it started with a man who heard something he wasn't supposed to and chose to do nothing about it, which was, she said, the most him thing that had ever happened. I said it started with a woman who said the true thing at 3 a.m. to someone who wasn't there yet and trusted the walls of an apartment to hold it and didn't know they hadn't. We were both right. The truth was that we had been in the same room for 2 years, both of us knowing where things were, and one night in February the furniture moved and we finally had to admit that we'd both been the ones moving it all along. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. What would you have done if you heard your roommate say your name at 3 a.m? Not to you, but in the voice people only use when they think no one can hear, and then had to decide whether to knock or go back to your room? And have you ever kept yourself on the other side of a door for so long that you'd stop noticing the door was something you could open? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.